Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Please keep eating. Feel free to get up and get seconds if you need. I'm Tim Carney. I'm a visiting fellow here at AEI. Visiting might be the wrong word because I've been visiting for about 7 years now. But what that word means is this is one of my two jobs. I'm also the commentary editor at the Washington Examiner. And both at the Examiner and at AEI, most of the work that I've done has been on cronyism, corporate welfare, that sort of thing. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And assisting me today is going to be an old friend of mine, Veronique de Rugy. She's a research fellow at Mercatus Institute. She used to be a research fellow here at AEI. She, unlike me, has a master's and PhD in economics, so that'll bring some expertise to the table.
You're as good at economics, and you know how to write. So that's what I call
yes,
my journalist
writing
friend.
is. But what we share. In 2015, we were both named by Politico magazine as jointly one of the top, 50 most important influencers in an issue of Politico magazine sponsored by Boeing. And that was very nice.
Well, especially because it was for our work on trying to get rid of XM.
Get rid of Boeing subsidies, which we will be talking about later. On that note, I will say this. Most of the events we have at AEI are a little less one-sided than this. Veronique and I are of a similar mind on a lot of things. And so that's partly because the purpose of this event is we're going to be showcasing some of the videos that I, with lots of AEI staff and outside help, have been working on over the last couple of years. And these are about the victims of cronyism, is what we call them. The reason I did this is because, well, so when I started talking about corporate welfare, cronyism, crony capitalism, whatever you want to call it, in 2005, 2006, there wasn't a very big audience. I wrote a book called The Big Ripoff that basically nobody bought. And once some radio host tried to book me and said, I'm confused. You say you're conservative, but you're criticizing Walmart here, and that just doesn't make sense to me. And it was kind of a foreign idea. Then in 2008, we got the Wall Street bailouts. And then Barack Obama bringing in the Chamber of Commerce on his stimulus, most of the healthcare industry on Obamacare. And that opened a lot of people's eyes, a lot of conservatives' eyes. And Sarah Palin said the word crony capitalism, and it spurred a lot of interest in it. And it was really heartening as a free market guy to see people making the distinction between pro-business and pro-market. But then one of the things I noticed about the enthusiasm on this was that it was kind of a negative enthusiasm, which is to say our friends at the Heritage Foundation came up with a project that they said, opportunity for all, favor for none. And when they did a focus group on this, they found people got a lot more excited about the second part, the favor for none. In other words, there was a level of envy in the concern about crony capitalism. After the bailouts, people said, well, where's my bailout? Which is not exactly the free market answer. And part of what became clear to me was that a lot of people believed what the pro-corporate welfare people were saying was that this was free money that was being given to these big businesses. And they just had a strong moral sense, whether this handout or this protectionism or this tax break or whatever, that they had a strong sense that this was wrong, but a lot of people didn't quite realize where the cost was coming from. Because here's the thing, trade and enterprise can increase the size of the pie. This is why we're so much wealthier as a world, as a nation, than we were decades ago. But when government, in most cases, in a well-established economy, after the rule of law is established, property rights, etc., when government intervenes, they're not actually increasing the pie. They're usually redistributing it. And redistributing it is a separate question when that's right. I'm a kind of bleeding heart Catholic. I think sometimes, yeah, we got to make sure that the poor aren't starving, aren't homeless, that sort of thing. But on economic development and all those issues, government officials, politicians, lobbyists always try to say, well, no, there is no downside. This is a win-win situation. Yes, we're helping these companies, but that's just going to help everybody. There is no loser here. But anytime a government program is defended as a win-win, that's a lie. And every time they are picking a winner, they are creating a loser in a modern, advanced economy. So that's what we're trying to accomplish with the videos, which we'll get to in a second. But first, I want to hear from Veronique.
Thank you for having me, Tim, and thank you for being here. I remember actually when your first book came out, The Big Ripoff, I was asked to comment on it, and I said, you're in for like a lot of books, and I suggested, how you could follow with all different sorts of way that government intervention in the market,
because my subtitle was How Big Business and Big Government Steal Your Money. You suggested Small Business and Big Government Steal Your Money.
Which you can all put it under the term of cronyism.
Yeah.
But the reason why, and it is true that, Tim has definitely been a leader. When you look at writing on the Export-Import Bank, when most of us were asleep at the wheel, Tim was already writing on this. And it's true that the battle of ideas started long before Tim, and you find people like David Stockman, who was highly invested in getting rid of XM, and Sally James also wrote some things at Cato about it. Tim was the one who was consistently fighting this fight, and he was a leader on this. But the reason I want to say we are so insistent that this is actually a really, really important fight to fight. It's because, in a sense, it's one of the biggest threats to capitalism per se. It gives capitalism a bad name. It allows people to say, look at these big businesses, look at these business who are, ripping us off. Of course, misunderstanding the fact that actually the reason why they're able to do this is because of the existence of a government that can distribute government-granted privilege, no matter what form it takes. Unfortunately, in this battle against cronyism, I have found that one of the arguments that people throw back at us is this idea that it really it's such small potato. Why should you care? And it is true in terms of spending. It's not a big deal, especially in a world where we have $1 trillion deficit and growing. It's roughly, depending on how you measure it. Obviously, there are different programs that some people say are cronyism. Other people are saying they're not. For instance, R&D. Is this cronyism when it's in the defense budget? Is it not? There are different opinions on this. And so it's like roughly, let's say, $100 billion a year, right? It's not that much. But the real reason Tim and I are so invested in this fight is actually not because of the budget aspect of it, even though obviously it bothers us. But it is because it is so profoundly unfair. And it is unfair mostly because of all the unseen victims of cronyism. And I loved your videos because you really highlight the true problem with cronyism and the real reason why we care. And I hope you'll care with us and join us in this fight.
Thank you. And so I'm going to show one video in its entirety. We're going to keep discussing. Happy to take questions in the middle. There's no specific Q&A later, but we're going to start with the one video we're showing in its entirety. And this one, I really felt I focused. This is on direct subsidies, the most direct form of handouts. And it was after watching Scott Walker, a good conservative governor, try to justify subsidies for the Milwaukee Bucks arena. And actually, at AI, we had a debate-ish thing on sports stadium subsidies, and we couldn't get anybody from like the local chambers of commerce or the Washington Nationals or the Redskins or whatever to defend their corporate welfare. So Kevin Hassett, who was then the head of economic program, said, well, I can't defend it economically, but I can go and say, actually, it's nice to have a local sports team, that this is a social benefit, and maybe we should sacrifice some economic efficiency for the sake of a social benefit. That's a tricky argument to have. Has to happen on 100 different cities. But this wasn't how Scott Walker justified this. He said, actually, subsidizing this basketball arena will make more money than it will cost, because he looked only at one cost, which was the direct either cost, revenue foregone through tax breaks, or the direct outlays of money. He did not consider that there were many other costs. So for direct subsidies, we use sports stadiums as an example. It applies to other things. So hopefully we'll watch it now.
Enterprise and business are good. Competition and the pursuit of profit create countless benefits for workers, consumers, communities, and society as a whole. Some politicians take the wrong lesson from this, though, and decide that if business is good, government ought to subsidize it. This benefits the subsidized businesses and some of its neighbors, but as always, such handouts create plenty of victims. Federal, state, and local governments hand out billions of dollars every year in incentives such as grants, tax credits, and other subsidies. One business that politicians love to subsidize is sports arenas and stadiums.
We propose a state investment of $220 million to build a new arena.
Billionaire owners and sports leagues often demand these subsidies. Politicians also say these subsidies generate economic growth, but the money for these subsidies doesn't come from thin air. It comes from taxpayers. So instead of letting the owners and fans pay for the team, subsidies shift the cost to everyone, including the people who aren't watching the games. For instance, taxpayers in Illinois are still paying for old renovations made to the Bears Soldier Field and for the White Sox subsidized stadium built in the 1980s. Meanwhile, Illinois is ranked as one of the worst states fiscally, with taxpayers constantly saddled with tax hikes. When stadiums get special tax credits, that shifts more burden onto the taxpayer. When they get cold hard cash, that also comes from the pockets of the taxpayer. This drain on government coffers also hurts the public by taking up money that could be used for public services, such as police, roads, and schools. And there are other less obvious victims of these subsidies. Subsidies can drive taxpayer and consumer spending to the arena and its neighborhood, but it typically doesn't increase total entertainment spending in a metropolitan area. Instead, a new stadium draws entertainment spending away from other places, restaurants, movie theaters, bowling alleys, that are in other parts of town. And redistributing economic activity according to politics creates one more victim, the economy of the whole city. In a 2017 poll of economists, an overwhelming majority agreed, quote, providing state and local subsidies to build stadiums for professional sports teams is likely to cost the relevant taxpayers more than any local economic benefits that are generated. So, direct subsidies are great news for subsidized companies, but they harm many others. They lead to hikes on taxpayers. They drain resources from other public services such as police and schools. They put other businesses at a disadvantage. And they slow down the local economy as a whole. It's just one more example. Every time the government tries to pick an economic winner, it creates economic losers. These are the victims of cronyism.
So we did not go with the version where I caught the football while jumping on stage or threw it right at the camera. But if I press the green button, it'll just go to the blank slide. There we go. And we could have added a lot more potential victims, and the video would have been a lot longer. I mean, in Milwaukee, for instance, they were tearing down an old parking garage to put up a new parking garage, and considering the new parking garage compared to zero. But every time you build something new, if you're tearing down something old, there's only a marginal gain. And the economists who justify this always have just such a limited mindset in what the costs are. And I think Scott Walker really did believe that the only difference was going to be the direct outlays there. Yeah. And I think politicians fall for that.
Yes. I mean, I'd add something, another victim. It's like the companies that are subsidized are not actually always winners. I mean, they are the picked winners, but there's a fairly big literature that actually shows that what ends up happening is when the government intervenes in a particular area, in a particular industry, with a particular business, whatever it is, whether it's a stadium, whether it's green energy, or what have you. What ends up happening is basically you create incentives for malinvestment, right? When companies are actually trying to, and measuring and trying to calculate and to decide where to invest their money, there's now a bias, a distortion in favor of where the government has intervened. And that actually has rolling effect. Because what happens, for instance, if you take subsidies for green energy, is basically capital tends to fly towards safety. And when the government invests in a particular area, it sends a signal of safety. So it's not and usually it's not necessarily done based on the merit of the project itself. And so it attracts private capital towards this investment that didn't, and that doesn't actually mean that it's going to turn out great. In some cases, it really actually doesn't.
No, and a great example of this happened out in Nevada. The state legislature out there subsidized the heck out of a new Elon Musk battery plant. So the guy doing Tesla, he wanted a battery factory out there, and they had plenty of open space, so you can't. One of the complaints about these subsidies as well, it's taking up resources that are allocated to another. So this is desert that wouldn't have been used for other things, so maybe that doesn't apply. But then there was this one article that talked to one of the suppliers out there who was somebody who was researching, they said 22 different battery technologies. But now that this factory was there, they were just going to do the lithium-ion batteries. And so 21 other battery technologies that were in the nascent stage of research just get scrapped and thrown out the window. So first of all, we as an economy, or if you care about the planet and you want there to be better batteries, and if you own a cell phone or a laptop, you really want there to be better batteries. But now there's government literally, and this wasn't their intention, but picking one technology. And what you're pointing out is, for that supplier, that might end up being a mistake induced by government.
So, yeah.
And so if you are a businessman, don't go chasing subsidy waterfalls. And you saw it happen with ethanol too. A lot of people in 2005, 2007, when those ethanol mandates came out, said this is where the future was, and it didn't end up working out for them.
Yes.
So again, we had a handful of other videos. The next one's about regulation. And a lot of people don't think of regulation as cronyism. They actually think of it as the opposite. They think, well, government sometimes subsidizes businesses, but on the other hand, it regulates them. And when you see articles in most mainstream papers, besides the Washington Examiner, you'll see, and when they try to quote both sides, they'll say, here is some environmentalists in favor of this regulation, and here is, Exxon or whoever opposed to it. So it's always somebody who cares about the public good versus some industry. But every once in a while, when they call the person who they assume will oppose it, that person supports it. So rather than piquing the curiosity of the reporter, they say, wait a second, right now, the Trump administration is rolling back fuel economy standards for cars, but even the automakers want these stricter standards. So I can't understand how they could possibly do it. Well, the Washington Post did a fact check when somebody said Congress has effectively outlawed the incandescent bulb. The Washington Post called the light bulb makers and were like, do you think that this is infringing on you? And they said, no, actually, we like this regulation. They said, so obviously this isn't a ban, this isn't a regulation, because even the light bulb makers like it. Now, why do the light bulb makers like it? Well, they were getting a profit of about a penny. It cost them 24 cents to make a traditional incandescent, and they sold it for 25 cents. This was capitalism at its best. Really low profit margins, which is good for us. It's not great for General Electric or whoever. And so they always kept trying to sell us these more expensive light bulbs. And anybody who's my age or older remembers this from the 80s, these giant honking incandescents, but nobody wanted them. So what did they do? They turned to Washington. In the Bush administration, they got a series of mandates that have effectively outlawed or made more difficult to attain the traditional incandescent, and that led to higher profit margins. As Veronique was pointing out, GE's lighting business is now one of the least profitable arms, so it didn't work for them, but it did work to prop up other higher, more expensive, higher profit margin LED bulbs and that sort of thing. So regulation often is pitched as protecting the consumer, but it ends up protecting incumbent businesses.
Yes. And the thing that's really interesting is like we often talk, when you talk about cronyism, whatever form it takes, and we say, oh, it kills innovation as meaning the competition, right? And the innovation induced by competition. But it actually also kills the innovation that the firms would have actually put forward, the subsidized firm would have put forward if it had to because of the pressure of the market. Like realizing that maybe this is not the best way to make the most money. And then so it creates massive amount of rigidities. And of course, they're not seen, right? And all this technology that could have been, that wouldn't be, all these businesses that could have been, that won't be, because of this, we rarely see them.
That's perfect segue. This is just an excerpt of this video.
But there's another victim, public safety. By killing competition, some regulations actually make the public less safe. Let's take an issue related to food trucks. The 2009 Federal Food Safety Modernization Act. This bill had the support of big food producers who could afford the costs.
And we have brought an industry which supports the bill. It will protect the American food industry, the processors, the manufacturers, and the growers against unfair competitions in places like China.
Small farmers, though, found the regulations too burdensome.
Every additional crop that we go to grow is more paperwork, is more time. We're not lawyers, we're farmers. We enjoy actually growing a crop, actually being in the field. I can't be expected as a small producer to do the same procedures as a multi-million-dollar facility. I'm not Driscoll's, I'm not Del Monte, I'm not Dole. If you're losing money year in and year out, it doesn't matter how much you enjoy it, you're not going to be doing it.
And here's the thing, by forcing out small players and driving consolidation in the food industry, these regulations can actually make food less safe. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have noted, quote, an increasingly centralized food supply means that a food contaminated in production can be rapidly shipped to many states, causing a widespread outbreak.
On that happy note, sorry about the syncing issues on that excerpt. But, so again, I'm a journalist, and sometimes I follow the money. I try to see who's benefiting from a particular thing. And sometimes some of our libertarian friends don't like that. They say, well, it doesn't matter who's profiting off of something. Just address the regulation, the rule, whatever, on its merits. And whenever I point out that a big business is lobbying for and profiting from a particular regulation, this is what people on the left say. This is what Timothy Noah said when he found out that Enron was supporting the Kyoto Protocol, which, if you guys remember, was the sort of original Paris Climate Accord. And he said, well, just because Enron supports this doesn't mean it's bad. But this sort of story of the big food processors supporting the regulation is very important in showing why this regulation will undermine its own goal. Once we realize the big food processors support it, we realize it's because they figure this will help protect them from the smaller guys, thus leading to consolidation. And if we know that consolidation in the food industry actually can undermine public health, then this food safety thing is undermining its own purpose. It was the similar story with Alcoa, aluminum company, big supporter of these fuel economy standards. Cars have to be made more fuel efficient, federal government mandates. Why? Well, car makers will use less steel, more aluminum. That makes cars more expensive, creating a victim. But the process of making aluminum, car parts, is a lot more environmentally intensive than the process of making steel car parts. It involves more energy, but also just the chemical process of getting the aluminum from the alumina, et cetera, necessarily gives off a greenhouse gas that's incredibly potent. So there's arguments about whether this lighter car is actually good for the environment. If it doesn't last long enough, it actually is worse for the environment. And so that's another case where following the money, seeing that Alcoa supported it, helps you understand, helps you figure out the victims, and then how that will undermine the purpose.
I think a very good example of this was given by Jamie Dimon, after Dodd-Frank, who basically, he said, well, his industry was targeted supposedly by Dodd-Frank, right? He said, I'm paraphrasing, said, this is great. Now, they've recreated a protective moat around our industry. It means no more entrants. Like, it's going to be really, really hard. This is why you also have to kind of wonder why ExxonMobil is super supportive sometimes of big green, environmental regulations. And I think one of the other really striking example, because the US is probably the worst when it comes to this, is the Jones Act. Right? I mean, the Jones Act, which is meant to protect the shipping industry in the U.S., has had a it's backfired quite dramatically, and it's increased the cost for everyone, in the process without the production, the consumer. There's no innovation, fewer ship build, and the Cato Institute has written a massive amount of really excellent thing on the Jones Act, and really it is an area where it is worth all of us directing our fire, because I think we have a shot, right? The battle of ideas take a long time. We have a shot of one day overturning this very detrimental regulation.
And again, I'll want questions in a second, but I'm just going to make a final point. The moral aspect of this, and one reason Vera and I get along well is because we're both free market moralists, and not all libertarian people like talking about morality. But the moral aspect of this is, it's wrong to, if the regulation is primarily serving, and in the regulation video we talked about food trucks being kept out, and restaurant owners actually admitting that this is why they want this regulation, and that's why it's on the books. If the regulation is primarily serving to protect someone from competition, that's not just economically inefficient, that's immoral. That is somebody who has a dream and some consumer who wants to do business with them, and it's using public power for a private good, and that's a problem. But to go back to the light bulbs, there's a corrosive effect if you care just about free enterprise. Say you are one of these amoral libertarians that my conservative friends like to worry about a lot. The light bulb law is a perfect story of how these companies were able, through government, to become the leftist caricature of capitalists. Suddenly they were selling you a product you didn't want at a high markup to what it cost them to make it, making your life worse, and you had no choice but to buy it. It's the same with the ethanol mandate, et cetera. They're making large profits because their access to government favors enables them to become what we say in capitalism doesn't happen, which is massive profit margins, no need to innovate, and selling you what you don't actually want to buy. Once that's what capitalism looks like. You guys remember Michael Moore's documentary on capitalism? It was all about crony capitalism. But once that's what capitalism looks like, it becomes impossible for us to stand up on stage and say, these CEOs deserve these salaries, these corporations should be free to do what they want, because it just becomes government picking a winner. But the winner is the people who least need the government backing.
And this is why I started by saying that cronyism is one of the biggest threats to capitalism. Not because it's rampant and everywhere and every company is a crony, but it's actually because that's what people point to when they want to talk about capitalism. And of course, the reason why crony capitalism is possible is because of the existence of the government and its ability. And I'll conclude by saying that the reason why, actually, everyone who works with me, who knows me, knows I'm literally heartbroken when I actually consider the victims and the unfairness of the whole thing. But it's actually a good marketing. It's better, as my friend and colleague Matt Mitchell, who shares our obsession with cronyism, said something very right, and he put it in the context of me being French. He said, no one wants to ride the revolutionary barricade for efficiency, but they will join you if you say you're fighting on fairness. And he is right. So I think it's really important. It's counterintuitive. Frédéric Bastiat, I found this great quote prompted by
She said Frédéric Bastiat, but she said it with a French accent, if you were wondering what she said.
Yeah. Sorry, Frédéric Bastiat.
Very good.
Bastiat, sorry. And he had this great quote, which I didn't know until today, which is the difference between a good economist and a bad economist is the bad economist is going to confine itself to the visible aspect of things. Well, the good economist is going to actually investigate also the visible aspect, but also all the unseen. And it's always my charge to try to convince people, because all of us can do it, to join us in this fight, and try to be really acutely aware and vigilant about all these unseen victims and the untold side of the story.
Well, unseen would be a perfect segue to the next video, but I do want to get to questions before we play the next excerpt. So we've got a microphone coming from behind. Frame your question in the terms of a question. Please make it brief, and please begin by identifying yourself. So right up front, Will or Marquane.
Hi, J.J. Rich from Reason Foundation. Who lobbies for the Jones Act?
Oh, I suspect that's not my area of expertise.
Yeah.
You may
So the
know,
Jones
but
Act is it is the shipping companies, the U.S. flagged shipping companies, and so you saw this after.
I suspect labor unions too.
Yeah, and their unions too. What happened? So the Jones Act says that if something is shipped from the U.S. to the U.S., it can only be a U.S. shipping company that does it.
And it's not just shipping company. It needs to be owned, U.S. owned, U.S. crewed, U.S. flagged, and U.S. built. This is why it's worse than all the, I learned a new word yesterday, cabotage or whatever. So every country has those cabotage law. I feel good saying this, even though I'm not exactly sure what it means. But the U.S. is definitely the worst because of those four aspects.
And so this is why, if you've ever been to Hawaii, everything's really expensive. Hawaii is also in the middle of nowhere, so it would be, but it's even more expensive because of that. If you're shipping something from Florida to Puerto Rico or from New York to Puerto Rico, it doesn't seem totally like a domestic thing, but it's there. The big shipping companies lobby for it, and their unions, and so this is why when the hurricane hit Puerto Rico last year, people said, let's at least give a temporary waiver for stuff going to Puerto Rico so they can get as much stuff as they need. When Trump was asked about this, he said, oh yeah, but I talked to some of the people in the shipping industry and they said that was a bad idea.
Even though it's actually not good for them, because the number of shipping, the shipping industry has shrunk quite dramatically as a direct result of the Jones Act. There are fewer shipping companies. They're in pretty bad shape, and their costs have actually skyrocketed too. So it's really weird. But I think it's because people can't imagine what the alternative of a bad system is.
And you're again highlighting a world. If you're operating in a world without competition, quality is going to go down.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons we free market people in nonprofit circles like this sometimes worry, is we need more competition. But I'll just say again on that Trump comment, Vero's exactly right when she says the biggest threat to free market capitalism is cronyism. And this is one of the reasons why. That even more policy-savvy Republicans than Donald Trump will get fooled by that. On the light bulb law, the exact same thing happened. Fred Upton, when he became the Energy Committee chairman, but when he was asked to support the light bulb law, he was reticent, and he admitted later on that he came around to it because the light bulb industry said, actually, this is a good one, go for it. So he thought that it didn't really count as big government because it was pro-business. So the fact that the big businesses have the ability to fool otherwise free market people into thinking it's fine is one of the reasons. And so the shipping companies lobbying for this, is one of the reasons it's so dangerous. So other questions right there in the back. Again, wait for the mic.
Hi, David Ditch, Heritage Foundation. I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the fiscal impact, in particular, not so much the spending side, but on the tax side, various targeted tax breaks and tax extenders, and the impact that that can have.
So I see it happening, the fiscal impact, more on the local level. One thing I wasn't able to include in one of these videos, but it was a small town that had given this massive tax break to a Walmart, and then found that the Walmart, the classic criticism is Walmart kills the downtown businesses. And that basically happened. So the businesses that were paying taxes got driven out of business, and the one that was replacing them wasn't paying taxes. So all the business taxes they had coming in disappeared. And so they were cutting down drastically on the police force. And so this town really, because they wanted to be sort of the big guys, they really got hit. And I focus on the smaller towns because, again, on the national level, it's not a huge thing. The tax extenders, the biggest special interest tax break is also the broadest. It's the domestic production tax deduction.
Well, you can also,
Mortgage
you can also see the mortgage interest deduction. You can see the
Yeah.
healthcare deduction,
Yeah.
as a big. So I'm actually glad you asked this question, because this is an area where there's a conflict among free market people, because people say, oh, it's a tax. It's like, so. For instance, if you take there's a table in the budget, and the Treasury has it called tax expenditures, and it's the government labeling any tax credit, tax subsidies, any of those a tax expenditures.
Which makes us uneasy.
Yeah, which makes us really uneasy, even though some of them are indeed way of spending money through the tax code. And we've had these debate about which one should we get rid of. And my position has always been the one that are targeting special interest, whether it's on the individual side or on the corporate side, but for the sake of this conversation, we should talk of the corporate side, absolutely should go. And those tax extenders are even worse than even those, because they're, on top of that, they are on a temporary basis, so it creates a lot of uncertainty. But the way I look at these, they should never be any subsidies in any form, to private companies, period. Either to an entire industry, or to a single industry, or it should not happen. The problem and the debate we have is like, well, but this is actually allow people to keep more of their money. Yes and no. Only some people, some company, and that is a problem, because it's just freaking unfair. I want the government to be really small, and I want all of us to pay as little taxes as possible. But I actually don't want the government to discriminate between us. And this is kind of I have these debate all the time. Do you remember with the Amazon tax breaks coming to Virginia? I wrote a piece, and my friend Jeff Tucker said, well, but it is Amazon keeping more of its money. And I said, well, not at my expense, dude. It's not, I just don't want this, or at the expense of all the other companies who actually don't get a tax break. Why? So it's an interesting
particularly
debate.
in Northern Virginia, to go back to the using up resources, some other business would be or is at the place where Amazon's going to be. So maybe Amazon's more valuable than them, but it's not compared to zero. But on the fiscal side, I would agree, mortgage interest tax break, if you got rid of that, got rid of the domestic production deduction, and changed the tax treatment of healthcare, you could lower all of those rates. Not by a huge amount. We're not talking about.
No, we're not talking. Because the biggest. I think I may or may not put the healthcare one, which is like the biggest of them all. But then, of course, the danger is like a lot of the people on the left say, oh, yeah, just get rid of all the tax expenditures. And of course, I mean, some of them we don't want to get rid of because
Imputed rent is a tax expenditure.
Well, the reason why, right, some of them are actually valuable is because they're actually a way to alleviate the double or triple taxation of your income. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, the reason we're uneasy on talking about this is because literally the Washington Post ran a piece saying, here's the 5 biggest ways, it was these Tea Partiers, these Republicans, they don't like big government, but here's the 5 biggest big government programs they benefit from. And half of them were literally the government just not taking your money. For instance, it was money spent keeping up your rental property you get a tax break on. This is literally, they're upset that you're a tax on profit and not on total revenue. And so that they want to tax more money than you're making, and they call it a tax expenditure that they're not doing.
Or the preferential rate for capital gains, for instance, is often targeted. And to be fair, there are a lot of free market people now who are saying, well, we should be taxed at this level of income. I disagree, because it's actually double taxation of income, and then the actual rate should be 0.
But we will have time for more questions, but Veronique had said, what is unseen? So I don't know if any of you guys have read Frederick Bastiat or if you've read Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson. Henry Hazlitt I read during college, and it was really the inspiration for this video. I didn't read it in college. I went to a great book school where you read mostly Plato and that sort of stuff. And one of the things about Plato dialogues is you see how Socrates sort of walks you through something, not to teach you exactly what he's saying, but to teach you a bigger lesson if you follow it. And Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson was that sort of book where it trained you to think every time somebody says this is a win-win or this government program doesn't cost anybody anything, you're going to A, have the instinct to say, no, that's probably not true, I doubt it, and B, sort of develop some of the skills to hunt down who the unseen victim is. So that was my inspiration in these videos. Hopefully, if you guys know students or whatever, you'll spread them around. The audio that's not synced on these excerpts is synced if you watch them on YouTube, or AI has a landing page for victims of cronyism. But that again and again, we couldn't go through all the victims, but to sort of develop the habit of saying, okay, there's got to be an unseen victim if government is picking a winner. So this is on protectionism. I try to go a little bit deeper than you might immediately go and into what is unseen.
So these quotas and tariffs that are supposed to protect American jobs in one industry end up costing jobs in another. The same thing happens in every industry.
Today's action sends a clear message that this president and our entire administration are determined to put American jobs and American workers first.
But those steel and aluminum tariffs raise costs on U.S. manufacturers who use steel and aluminum. Again, all of these costs get passed along to the consumer. Paying more for her car, her sugar, her can of soup, she has less left over for other expenses, which creates another hidden victim of protectionism: the businesses where she can't spend money.
So that idea and this, that something that didn't happen is really hard to measure, really hard to point to. That there's some grocery store who, or there's some movie theater that didn't get a customer because the customer is paying more for her car, her sneakers, that sort of thing. And this is one of the reasons if we asked about lobbying, in public choice theory, there's a lobby for the existing businesses. There's not a lobby for the business that doesn't get it. And the diffuse costs of this, all the other businesses there might not even be a shock. They might not notice that they're losing the business until you zoom out and look at the whole economy. Guess what? The special interests have a lobby. The whole economy doesn't have a lobby. And this is why pointing out the unseen and developing the habit of looking for that is so important.
What we can measure, though, when it comes to protectionism and steel tariffs, for instance, in particular, is that it's not just, it's harder to measure at the final consumer level. But one of the things that's important about steel is that actually there's 140,000 roughly employees in the steel industry, but there are roughly 6.5 million workers in the steel consuming industry, and that's not just the final. It's much, much broader when you use final consumers, and it's actually really quite stunning to see, even though it doesn't actually show necessarily big time at the scale of the country, because trade is such a small share of, as important as it is, it's still a small share of our economy. I mean, it's striking to see actually the impact on those consumers, still consumers who are manufacturers in the downstream of the tariffs. And you can hear them plead with Uncle Sam and President Trump and begging them to give them an exemption because they are hurting big time. And what's actually quite striking about this exemption process that was put in place is like one of the biggest player in deciding whether or not there will actually be a granted exemption is, do you know whom? One of the biggest steel company, Nucor. And so my colleague, Christine McDaniels, has actually done a lot of work on these steel exemptions and the process and the cronyism that goes alongside with it. And you can measure that cost, and it's heartbreaking.
Again, back to questions 1 second, but again, on that cronyism point and the lobbying for exemptions and going back to what Vera was saying earlier about the tax extenders. They're called the extenders because they're these special tax breaks like NASCAR tax breaks, et cetera, that get renewed every couple years. But one of the beautiful things that does for this town is create a permanent lobbying class. So if you are a former top staff member on a Ways and Means Committee or the Senate Finance Committee or the Treasury Department, you know the more of these extenders that are special interests here that are expiring there, the more it creates this lobbying. And again, that's good for the property values of everybody in this room, but it also obviously creates losers. There's less money. It becomes less valuable for industry to innovate than it does for them to lobby. The R&D becomes less valuable to them than the schmoozing and the influence game, and that obviously has broad negative impacts on innovation and economic advance. So more questions before the final one. So yes, over there. Wait for the microphone. Will be coming in a moment.
Yeah, I was just curious whether you would call the child tax credit a cronyism.
Well, it's not cronyism because it's not corporate, but it's a special interest deduction.
Do I need to step out of this discussion because I'm the single biggest beneficiary of the child tax credit in this room? I think I have 6 kids. So. Yeah, do I have to recuse myself? Here's what I'll say.
So again, it's not cronyism because it's on the individual side.
Yeah.
It is, in my opinion, and I have children, so I benefit from it, but I'd happily get rid of it. It is a special interest. Basically, it's the tax code deciding that you deserve to pay less taxes because you have children.
Yeah, you called the mortgage deduction a special.
Yeah. Well,
but the mortgage, when you actually track who benefits from it, they're actually, because
it's the realtors and the mortgage lenders more than the homeowners.
It's the final interest group lobbying for this.
But you don't think the homeowners benefit from it?
Sorry?
You don't think the homeowners benefit?
If you bought your home before it became law and then you sold it after, that's the only class of homeowners that really benefits from it. But I want to defend the child, not the tax credit. We used to have, until TCJA, the tax cut bill, personal and dependent exemptions, which is to say the 0% rate, which is now just the standard deduction or your deduction, the 0% rate expanded and covered more territory for a household of 2 than a household of 1, et cetera, more for a household of 3 than that sort of thing. This I will defend. I believe in a 0% rate up until at least the poverty line and or approximately the poverty line. I think that as long as somebody's still working to put food on the table, far better than giving them food stamps and Medicaid and all that is letting them keep every dollar they earn, at least as much as they can. If you work in payroll taxes, it gets even more complicated. But as much as possible, we should have a 0% rate for people until they're taking care of their basic needs. And that was what the idea of a personal exemption was. And a household, my household, I have a lot more food to put on my table than a household of one. So I'm not saying I should get a tax break for my Catholic school tuition, et cetera, but that my 0% rate should be bigger than a household of one, I absolutely believe in. What the Tax Cut Jobs Act bill did is got rid of that 0% rate and replaced it with a tax credit. I think that was a very unfortunate trade-off because now I'm getting a tax credit. Uncle Sam is paying me for having a kid, is how it feels. Well, it used to be I'm keeping the fruits of my labor more. So I think that's an unfortunate trade-off in that regard. So right here in the middle.
John Soliday, economist. What moral argument would you present to counter the made in America versus unfair foreign competition, particularly China? And now open trade is anathema to so many people. Before it was gospel.
So I think Vera will have more interesting things to say on this, but I'm just going to quickly say what we've argued in Washington Examiner editorials again and again is that U.S. sanctions should not be broad-based tariffs, but should be targeted at where there is cheating the most, and that we should go after their state-owned enterprises and go after places where they're clearly trying to rig the game rather than broadly slap tariffs on them to protect it. But even that is a very dangerous game to play because once you start that process and every special interest in the U.S. lines up and says, well, they're cheating by not paying their workers as much and that kind of thing. So I'm hesitant to play that game, but if we are going to, it should be super targeted. But
and then I'd say also that import competition is not, cheating. But the reason why, like made in America, this is not a new concept. It's just kind of, I put on the front stage, and it's kind of on steroid an argument right now. But the reason why it's so unfair that it's effectively in order to protect a few American producer, it forces other producers who consume that protected industries good for their own production, but also the consumers to pay higher cost. And that's just, again, it's a transfer of wealth. It's like it's shifting resources from one group to another, and it's creating also. One of the things that's hard to see, and you and I have made that case very often, is like what's really hard is like you can actually point at the winners, right? And some of the ways, but it's very hard to actually because the cost of a government program and the victims usually are really dispersed. They're harder to see, and they're also harder to make the case for themselves because sometimes they don't even know they're victims. But one of the things that we know from the academic literature is that actually that distortions that it's created by this shift in resources is actually a net negative for the economy. It's not necessarily a big one, right? But it's a net negative. And it's just hard to argue why our own government should be actually promoting policies that makes us all worse off. And by the way, the fact that other countries are subsidizing their industries or the fact that they're protecting their industries and hence making their economy at the margin worse off is certainly not something we should be emulating.
That's exactly right. The argument on...
Which baffles me that we hear it all the time. They do it. Oh yeah, you jump from a bridge, so I'm going to do it too.
Export-Import Bank, the number one defense of it is, well, we have to do it because China's doing it too. But the best study that's been done on these other countries' export finance has found that, China is making its economy smaller by subsidizing its exports. But the exporters are politically connected. So it's enriching the politically connected people at the expense of the rest of the economy. And there are cases in developing economies where an infant industry gets protection and that can help the country in a developing economy. But in a developed economy like ours, it doesn't. But that.
And by the way, on the Export-Import Bank, I will say, if you come out with anything here today, remember that the biggest beneficiary in 2014 on the foreign side of the Export-Import Bank were Chinese companies.
Chinese
state-owned companies.
So speaking of subsidized finance, the final video is largely about stuff like the Export-Import Bank. The excerpt I brought out here, though, was on what Vera was just talking about before, which is the cost to the broader economy. And then afterwards, we can talk about our other problems with XM. But here's the final excerpt.
Sometimes, instead of making direct loans, government gives guarantees to the loans made by regular banks. In that case, the government is choosing who gets the loan. This creates another victim. The borrower who would have gotten the loan if Uncle Sam hadn't propped up its own favored borrower with a guarantee. This is why economists agree that such government financing, quote, merely shifts production among sectors within the economy, but does not add to the overall level of economic activity. The final victim is the entire US economy. When the government is the lender or is directing lenders through guarantees, money goes to the politically favored businesses instead of the most economically promising. That harms economic efficiency, especially because politicians aren't exactly the best at figuring out where economic promise lies.
As you can see, if you build a better solar panel, the world will beat a path to your door. Building a smarter solar panel is exactly what Solyndra has done.
So that last point about the economic efficiency, that's exactly, though, what you were saying, Matt Mitchell points out, is not going to win hearts and minds. Anytime I once used the word general equilibrium in a debate, and I realized that was not a winning point. It was something I'd picked up from my economist friends. But it is true. And if you need something else to motivate you at the end of the day, if you're an economist, that should be the thing. When the government is picking these winners, one loser is going to be the whole economy, because we know that Stephen Chu and Donald Trump, et cetera, are not going to allocate resources more efficiently than the market as a whole. But we haven't really picked.
I actually want to point out, because since we brought out the Solyndra, that everyone knows was a beneficiary of actually many different government programs, but in particular the 1705 loan program, which was a loan guaranteed for green energy and solar in particular. But the thing that's really, really hard, and it collapsed dramatically, and by the way, that was boosted under Obama, but it's a program, 1705, that was created under President Bush. But one of the things that's really hard in fighting the fight that we are fighting is, like, it's easy to point to the Solyndras. But the truth of the matter is, like, very often the Solyndras are actually the exception to the fight. They're the exception. And the reason is like, when you look at the 1705 loan program, 90% of the money actually went to companies that have plenty of access to capital. They were already in that business. They're multinational organizations that are already in that business. And in fact, the head of NRG Energy Company, which was his name, Green, he said, this is the best possible deal. It's basically I'm getting subsidized for doing what I was doing before, which is effectively putting solar panel in the desert. And that's the kind of, and these guys are not going to go under. And you know why they're not going to go under? Because they weren't going to go under, even if they weren't subsidized. Because it was actually a fairly low risk, safe investment that the capital market would have actually funded and was funding. And so the difficulty is then for us to point out, it's easy to say Abound Solar, Solyndra, right? But the real reason, sure, we're offended by this, right? We're annoyed because there was clearly massive political connection between these guys and the Obama administration and all of that stuff. But the real scandal is actually all these, it's Cogentrix, which is, belongs to Goldman Sachs. It's all of these companies that are actually getting 1705 loan. And what does it mean? It means that basically their borrowing cost is lower than their competitors, right? And it's not that suddenly the business is created and the activity is generated. It's just that suddenly the government has picked that this company, these particular winners are going to get lower cost. And the cost to this is even harder to show because it's all these distortions with capital lending, market shifting towards these loans. Because when you have the power of the federal government, it is really clear. There's no doubt. There's no lower, there's no entity that can borrow at lower cost than the federal government. So the capital is shifting there. And then, as I said, we saw it with the bounce dollar and a lot of other, where there was no capital, private capital that was willing to actually go and invest in the bounce dollar until they got the 1705 loan program. And then
But as you were saying, a lot of these,
it's really hard.
A lot of these guys would already get the financing. So when Export-Import Bank lost its quorum on its board and lost its ability to basically subsidize Boeing jets and GE engines, because without a board it couldn't approve financing of more than $10 million, what happened? There was actually a scramble between two different entities, one of which Boeing basically assembled something called the AFIC, the Aircraft Financing, I forget what it was a coalition of lenders, insurers, and all this that became this almost, the Obamacare would have called it an exchange for financing aircraft. And financing became more copious. There was new sorts of financing that was innovated on and that sort of thing. But they still kept lobbying to restore this power because they could get it cheaper and easier without all the mess of having to go out to the marketplace when they could get more of it from Export-Import Bank. But as soon as Ex-Im stepped out of the way, these private financiers stepped in. But most of them were also getting the sort of guarantees from Ex-Im, so they liked Export-Import Bank existing, and because they were getting one guy at an Export-Import Bank annual conference told me at the reception, he said, he worked for Citibank, he said, well, this is free money. We make a loan, and if Air China doesn't pay us back, the federal government does. Why would we not love this?
Yeah, and then what we see in other programs, like it was true for the 1705, and it's true for the Small Business Administration, there's actually a market for these loan guaranteed, the guaranteed portion. So the banks not only make money because they're making money on interest while not shouldering the risk, but on top of that, they sell the guaranteed portion, and they make a lot of money on that. So it's like, and Ex-Im, we saw, I wrote a paper that compared Ex-Im in 2014 with Ex-Im 4 years later when again, it had been, its funding had been cut really effectively by 85%, and its activity was clearly diminished, and you saw all the big players were not in anymore, and they were doing fine. And I was just reading an article last night about the satellite industry was an area where basically because a lot of, whether it's because Ex-Im lost its charter, but also there were a lot of problems in Europe, it's an area where basically there hasn't been a lot of these this government entity loan guaranteed bureau, and the industry has thrived because they've found a lot of much more convenient financing tools that are much more flexible for their business. And so it's going to be interesting to see if they actually step back into the Ex-Im business.
Yeah, we'll take some more questions, but I just want to make a final note on that. Alexis de Tocqueville once said that he said sometimes with an overbearing government, people use the term patriarchal, but that's the wrong word, because no father worth his name would raise their kids in such a way that they didn't have to take risks and they weren't building self-reliance. But this is what an overweening government does, is raise children up to never be fully adults. And there's an economic analogy that you keep hitting on here, that whether it was the Detroit's Big Three, whether it was aircraft financing when Ex-Im was up and going, whether it was these battery companies we're talking about, et cetera, without the pressure to innovate, they actually are worse off. They're protected from competition, which is kind of a nice thing to have, but then you lose the benefits of a robust economy. Anyway, we've got about 10 minutes left. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So microphone right behind you.
Good afternoon. David Krukoff, Douglas County, Maryland, the future of the District of Columbia. You've talked a lot about corporate capitalism, cronyism, but could you talk about nonprofits, government, political parties? They're all in the business of being in business. AEI owns real estate here. In the District of Columbia, we are particularly affected by the lack of being able to tax real estate. Shouldn't nonprofits, government, and other types of organizations like that participate with real estate taxes, at least to maybe a lesser extent? And would you comment on that thought? Thank you.
Should DC be able to tax the federal government, I think, is a great question. And then, you know,
GW, for example.
GW is like the most expensive real estate of any college in the world. And I don't get excited about taxing nonprofits because these days people want to tax the church and that sort of stuff. On the other hand, I think, well, the tax preferred status of some of these institutions is a lever by which government is going to try to tweak them, so it could actually be liberating, even if it's costly, for them to give up some of their tax benefits. And obviously a lot of nonprofits are actually businesses. So much of the healthcare system, whether it's Johns Hopkins, I mean, that's not really a business. The NCAA is not a business. Kaiser Permanente. All of these things are technically nonprofits, but they're actual businesses. Some of this is an argument for abolishing a corporate income tax altogether, but because certainly having it and then having all these exemptions creates more of this lobbying game. I don't know if you have.
No, it's really not an area that I know well and how it works and what part of the nonprofit are taxed or not. I'm not quite sure, so I can't really speak, in an informed way. But I'll look into it.
A couple more questions. Yes, ma'am, over. The microphone's right behind you.
But that said, if there's cronyism, I mean, I'm against it all. Like, I'm one of those rare people. I'm against, subsidies to small businesses. A lot of my, conservative friends will say, oh, yeah, small business is different. It's not. In my opinion, it's not. I'll get rid of it all.
Oh, Hopkins. You mentioned that capital gains was double taxation. Why is it double taxation?
Because it's first taxed at the income of the corporation level, and then it's redistributed, but it's income that's already been taxed.
Okay.
So.
All right. We've got right in the middle here, the microphone's coming from your right shoulder.
But again, there's people who are willing who said that actually
yeah,
we get rid of it. Yeah, but it's a preferential race.
And you don't pay on the first 500,000 or whatever of gain. So
that's the logic also behind the estate tax, like the first whatever millions exemption.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, hi. My name's Elaine Middleman. I'm an attorney, and first of all, I worked on the first Chrysler bailout, and I think I am a victim of capital cronyism, which I'd be glad to talk to you about. But I was wondering if you studied the EB-5 program, because I've also been working on the Skyland Shopping Center project in Southeast Washington, D.C. that was funded with HUD money and now with EB-5 money. And I just now read today former Mayor Gray wants to have some kind of other subsidy for more grocery stores in Anacostia or something.
So, and first I'm going to have to apologize because in a minute when I leave, I have to run straight to the airport and fly out of town, so I can't linger like I like to. But EB-5 is a type of visa that gets granted basically to people who are going to bring massive amounts of investment to develop. So if you are a Chinese citizen who's willing to build a shopping mall in outside of Winchester, Virginia, you can get a special visa together with your investment. I use Virginia because Terry McAuliffe, the former governor there, was a huge fan of these. He tried to use it to subsidize his green car company. I don't even remember all the details on that. And so this creates an interesting tension among people who are sort of for free enterprise and for business, because one of the arguments in the Trump era from Republicans of all stripes is, well, we should make sure that the immigrants we're getting are people who we need and will juice the economy, and not just people who either will go on welfare or will drive down working class wages where there's problems. So that would seem to lean towards something like, if you're a deep pockets money man, we ought to let you in. On the other hand, I really am morally put off by the idea of selling visas.
I'm not.
I'm the second most libertarian person on the stage. I mean, do you have opinions on EB-5? I don't like it.
I mean, my stand on immigration is like, if people want to come here, invest, work, all that stuff, just please be my guest. The problem with these, and I'm so glad you actually bring this up, because it is a problem as it relates to subsidies and to cronyism in general, is that it comes with string attached. So these guys are actually not allowed to come and invest their money where they're going to actually give them returns. They have to go and invest the money where the government decides they're going to be lucrative for them to brag and to fund their project. So usually it goes to places that are in disarray, places where they can't attract capital. But there's a reason why they can't attract private capital to these particular projects in the first place. So it actually creates, first it induces, there's some corruption. Absolutely, there's some corruption that's created, right? But it probably doesn't actually bring really good returns anyway. So it's kind of, this is where I have really mixed feelings. I'm all in favor of having some business investment visa, but I just don't want the string attached. And we see it with government. It's never take this money and do whatever you want with it, whatever you judge is the best. It's always like, states will give you that grant, but you're going to have to invest it and pay workers that particular wage, prevailing wage, and all that. And it doesn't work.
All right, we have time for one more question, so let's go in the back to my old friend Richard Morrison.
Thanks. There seems to be a kind of emotional resonance with people who work in certain industries in America. So a lot of people like the idea of people who work in the car industry or the steel industry or unemployed coal miners and things like that. So a lot of people support programs that help those people, but no one wants to vote for a subsidy for someone who works at the whoopee cushion factory. So given the fact that we have a lot of positive feelings about certain industries and are sort of ambivalent or not interested in others, what does that teach us, if anything, about fighting cronyism and public messaging on the issue?
So I'll answer on two sides of this. And the second one bringing a little bit of skepticism maybe to some of our arguments. But the first is, have you ever noticed how every city or county declares that they are going to become the biotech capital or whatever? So there's two things they want. They want biotech and they want Hollywood, because these are cool. And Josh Barrow, a very good writer, once said, if you are a county going to bid and try to bribe somebody to come into your industry, the worst two would be one of these, because everybody else is bidding for it. And so that definitely is a lesson about politicians, and the good they're looking after is somehow either it's their reelection, it's their self-image, we are now a cool place to live, all of those things are more valuable. On the other hand, Donald Trump got elected not touting a cool industry at all. It was coal miners and it was factory workers. And if he could have made a more expansive argument, and what some of his supporters say is there were positive externalities to there being plentiful manufacturing jobs in the United States. In other words, we were better off as a country when a guy could graduate from high school, work 30 years, pay, his wife could either also have the same job or stay at home, take care of the family, and maybe even retire with a little fishing cabin somewhere, that we were better off as a country because of that. And you could even argue that the opioid epidemic and those sort of things are part of it. So yes, I'm talking about my book, which I saw somebody brought a copy, but I won't sell it here because you can buy it on Amazon. But what I would argue there is that ultimately that is pushing up against the sports arena, against the limits of economics. The argument for subsidizing the sports arena is we would rather be a little poorer and have the Milwaukee Bucks. Why you'd want the Milwaukee Bucks, I don't know. But we'd rather be a little poorer and have a sports team. And so similarly, we support safety net programs, even though most of them don't juice the economy, because we'd rather be a little bit poorer and not have people starving to death in the streets. So some of the emotional resonance might be a reflection of saying either there were positive externalities of these industries, or a humbler claim, there were social goods to these industries existing that are not captured in the economics. So again, I think that's an argument about the limit of economics to tell us what is the public good, rather than a rebuttal of the economic arguments that we're making. Anyway, Vera, I'll let you make a final point before we...
No, actually, I actually think it's kind of pretty easy to make the case of what is a public good or not. And private companies aren't a public good. They aren't. They may be argument for national security, and these are actually best addressed with national security tools as opposed to economic tools. But I think, I may be cold-hearted. That's fine. I've been accused of that many times. But I have zero problem, subsidizing poor people. That's, to me, it's like in a rich society like ours, I think it's a no-brainer. I don't say it doesn't come at a high cost. It doesn't create distortion. That it's just pure cherry on cakes. And even for the recipient, I'm good with that. Subsidizing any private company is just something that I find absolutely unappealing. Because it's like, then how do you pick one from the other? Why is it that SBA loans go to a lot of restaurants? And then basically you have restaurants in the same streets. Some of them have access to really favored term borrowing, and while their competitors doesn't. I just cannot ever find an economic argument or a moral argument for it.
Every time government picks a winner, it's creating a loser. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.